Welcome to episode 2 of the Pipeline Online Podcast, featuring Crown Investments Corporation Minister Jeremy Harrison speaking about how Saskatchewan is not turning its back on coal, but instead looking to rejuvenate it and rebuild it to operate for the next several decades. Hi, it's Brian Zinchuk and Bronwyn Eyre, and we are on episode 2 of the Pipeline Online Podcast, where we're going to be talking to Minister of Crown Investments, Jeremy Harrison. And just before we bring Jeremy on, Bronwyn, what are your thoughts on what's going on with coal?
Well, I think it's a radical announcement that Premier Harrison or Minister Harrison has made, and really a long time coming in a lot of ways, and certainly a long time coming for the Southeast and specifically Estevan and Coronach. So I'm sure we have a lot of people listening in with keen interest, Brian.
So here we've got Mr. Jeremy Harrison. Jeremy, can you tell us a little bit about yourself, what your portfolio is, and what's going on?
Sure. Well, thanks so much, Brian, for the invite. And Bronwyn, I appreciate it as well. Great to see you. My title, Minister of Crown Investments Corporation, really pertinent, I think, for this discussion, though. Minister responsible for SaskPower, and look forward to the conversation here as we move forward.
So we had a big thing happen here in the last 2 weeks. Something that I honestly was totally gobsmacked when I found out about this. And for the last many years, at least since the teens of the years, the federal government has said you can only run your coal assets until 50 years or 2030, whichever's first, and we're going to shut them off unless you put carbon capture. And we've only put carbon capture on one generating unit, Boundary Dam 3, which meant that theoretically, if we follow the federal legislation, we have to shut off all of our coal fleet, about 1,400 megawatts minus 150 for Boundary Dam 3 by 2030. The problem is that on any given day when it's cold and there's no wind and there's no sun, up to 40% of our power comes from coal. And that if we turn it off in 2030, we're going to have grandma freezing in the dark, quite literally. So given that, Saskatchewan has been looking at developing nuclear. We've been building wind. The federal government has really been pushing wind and solar. So tell us how we got to what you announced 2 weeks ago.
A lot in there, Brian. So I will start by saying this. We had already announced about a year and a half ago that we were going to continue to run our existing assets to end of life. So that part of the announcement wasn't new. That really focused on Shand and Boundary Dam 3. What we are really looking at right now, though, is extending the lives of the coal-fired generation units that we have in place right now, and really where that came from. We've been having a number of discussions about these things, but it was really very crystal clear during the election campaign that what we heard from the public were two concerns, and that was affordability and reliability as it relates to the power grid. And, we came back and looked after the election. I was very fortunate to have been appointed as Crown Investments Corporation Minister, responsible for the commercial crowns, and took a really hard look right at the very front end about what that future could look like as far as our power generation matrix. Really with an eye to both of those things, reliability and affordability, and I actually say it in that order when we're talking about power generation. So, we have basically an all of the above approach that we're going to be taking going forward. That obviously includes natural gas, that includes renewables, and I'm not anti-renewable by any measure. I mean, we have about 30% of our fleet right now. Potential generation is renewable. Important to remember, though, that when you're talking renewable, your availability rates are between 5 and 10% over time. So that means you have to have backup baseload power for those renewable generation units. What we have been doing is putting online additional natural gas production facilities, but also we have about 25% of our available energy, and it can be up to 40, as you well point out, is coal. And that had been the backbone of our power system here in Saskatchewan and has been for decades and decades, back into the 1950s. So All of these things added up to the fact that we needed to take a look at what we know how to do, what we know is affordable, what we know is reliable, and that is coal. So I was down last week. I had the opportunity to meet with our leadership at SaskPower, both in Coronach and in Estevan, with our employees directly. As well. I wanted to say as well, great discussions with our labor leadership. IBEW have been fantastic to work with. The mining union have been fantastic to work with as well, providing some very, very important insights into some of the operational issues around these things. And also with the communities, Estevan and Coronach, both the RMs and the other municipal government. So what I came away with, and I wanted to tell these folks directly, is we were taking a very, very hard look at extending the lives of these facilities and making sure we fully understood the implications from the community's perspective, from our workforce's perspective, from the facilities perspective. And based on all of those things, we are working through a process to give a clear answer by summer, which is what I committed to our staff and our team. Really great folks who are working at these facilities to have that long-term answer, many of whom have had to make some very difficult decisions about what their futures are going to look like. So I want to get them this answer quickly, and I'm really excited about the process we're working through at SaskPower right now.
You're on mute, Brian.
Sorry about that. I keep doing that. A friend of mine is a miner. And, he had seriously looked at Plan B, developed a business. It hasn't worked out as well as he had hoped. And he's my age and looking at what is he going to do, because when you're in your 50s or late 40s and your job was destined to disappear in 3 or 4 or 5 years, actually, it would have been from today, it'd be 4 years, 11 months, and 7 days. What do you do? And for him, it was an enormous relief that he can continue operating heavy equipment and continue doing the mining for this. I wanted to talk a bit about, understanding why we're doing this, because the federal government has really, really pushed. I remember talking to Minister Duncan about this. Wind and solar. We have to build wind and solar. We had, when we did the commitment to, or get the equivalency agreement, we agreed to build 3,000 megawatts of wind and solar. But the reality is, I've written over 100 stories about the fact that wind and solar are not reliable. Alberta's got now over 5,600 megawatts of wind. And at any given time, it all goes to 0 or 2 or 10 megawatts. And that's more than the entire Saskatchewan provincial grid if everything was operating, which it never does. And it all goes to 0. It's just utterly unreliable. And of course, the sun goes down every day. So how much was that a factor in deciding that, base load and reliability is the ultimate importance?
Well, I would start, I'll get to the last part, but I would start by way of addressing the preamble as far as the federal government's perspective on all of this. I have been very, very clear, and Bronwyn was very, very clear and did some great work on this as Minister of Justice about the fact that the federal government have no standing in this discussion. Electricity generation is exclusively a provincial area of jurisdiction under Section 92A of the Constitution. It was specifically added in at the request of Alberta and Saskatchewan through the 1981-82 patriation process that culminated in the 1982 Constitution. It was specifically negotiated as a part of the Section 92A, 91 division of powers. So there is no question that we have the authority. The federal government have no standing in making regulation outlawing any particular form of energy generation. So what we are going to be doing is what is best for our people here in this province, what is best for SaskPower customers, and what makes the most sense as far as our power generation mix in this province. The reality is that we have a supply of coal in Saskatchewan measured in the hundreds of years that we own, that is owned by the people of this province as a resource. There is no other country, save a few, in the world that would keep a resource like that in the ground and not utilize it. And frankly, the government of Canada, even to a degree, recognize that in that they are facilitating exports of coal mined in Alberta and British Columbia to be put on trains, shipped to the Port of Vancouver, unloaded, loaded on ships, shipped across the Pacific Ocean, unloaded in destinations like Japan, put on trains, taken to thermal coal generating facilities, unloaded and burned unmitigated. I do not know what you are achieving by way of global greenhouse gas emission reductions by facilitating that happening. Why would you not just actually use the resource in your own jurisdiction? So that was a part of it. Understanding as well. I mean, other jurisdictions are moving forward in a very big way on this. China, for example, permitted 70 gigawatts of coal-fired generation last year. 2 new thermal coal plants per week are being generated there. Our entire production capacity in this province is 2% of what China is bringing online every single year. If you look at the entire fleet in China, we are 0.01%. So, for the federal government to be, grandstanding and kind of making these commitments and committing provinces where they have no authority, it makes no sense. Our bottom line here in Saskatchewan, what is best for our customers of SaskPower? What is best for our Crown-owned utility going forward? And that is going to be the only consideration, not what the Government of Canada want to dictate to us. So,
Bronwyn, I wanted to ask you here, because you are a front woman on this for 2 years as Minister of Justice, and prior to that in Energy and Resources, dealing with the Saskatchewan First Act, which was brought in to basically proclaim that we are not going to be told what to do, as Jeremy mentioned here. But I'd like to know, what was that fight like? Like, when you were having those discussions with the federal government, what were they saying? Like, thou shalt do this and we don't care if your people freeze? Like, what were the discussions like?
Well, we know that the federal government had a very, very top-down approach. I mean, they'd like to be, a federal government in the truest sense, and selectively ignore, Section 92A, among other provincial rights, when it suits them. I mean, that's the obvious thing. All the policies that we've seen, coming down in recent years, from, clean electricity regulations to clean fuel standard to carbon tax to EV regulations, they're all top down and they all ignore 92A. So they just hope no one would really notice. And I think one of the things that we got quite a lot of blowback on was changing our own constitution to embed 92A in it. And there were a lot of naysayers saying, well, you can't do that. Well, we absolutely can. Quebec did it. Prime Minister Trudeau said Quebec could do it. So I think it's actually a powerful tool. And I think we should make that point more often, that it is actually embedded. That's what we chose to embed in our own constitution, is the power of provinces over power generation and extraction of natural resources. Absolutely, it's in our power, and no one can say otherwise. And the point of it's before my time. I think we probably should have, not allowed, quote unquote, Harper to go down this road on coal. I've always thought it was unfortunate that we got that, we sort of let that happen, because it established that top-down infringement in, what is fundamentally ours. And I've always said, it should have been basically the feds coming after, every single worker, in Boundary and everywhere else, and extracting them one by one, because that was on them. And obviously, it became a lot more radical, after Prime Minister Trudeau came in, and it was more staggered before. Nevertheless, still our jurisdiction. So I think that certainly there were a lot of naysayers, and continue to be, but I think it's becoming more and more acknowledged. I mean, let's be honest, that power generation, extraction of natural resources is up to the provinces. It was hard fought for, and there for a reason. There's really not much one can say about it. So that is, absolutely, from my perspective, that goes without saying, and very supportive of this. I did want to ask Minister Harrison, I guess, just sort of coming back to the announcement, as I referenced, radical, seemed to be radical, and certainly very, very welcome. You're right. I mean, there was the announcement last year that there was, a running out of coal to, certain, not intervening preemptively and sort of letting things run out. Strangely enough, that was a not wildly high profile. It's almost as if people didn't quite notice, who weren't in the Southeast or weren't paying as much attention, more broadly speaking. I'm not sure if they will on this. And we'll get to that in a moment. I mean, some of the commentary that's already circulating. But one question on the announcement, and I think the reason why, I guess from your perspective, you think, whether it's mayors, whether it's, people who are active down there, why they're taking this as such a relief, such a radical, piece of news. I wanted to get your perspective on that and why you think that is. And I guess, just the comment by the Premier yesterday about how the province was, quote unquote, closely considering extending the life of our existing coal-fired plants, maybe wasn't appearing in that quote to be going full bore. Is that an accurate characterization? Just wanted to get your sense of that.
Okay, so the two parts to that. Firstly, on the response in the local communities, obviously, the local communities have been very, very supportive of this direction that we are going in the reconsideration. And what they have done as well, and I give them great credit, the mayors and the Reeves, for being vocal about it and fully understanding the pushback that is coming, and be under no illusion. I've shared with colleagues, and you well know this, Bronwyn. The pushback that is coming from the environmental activist left is going to be profound. This really, to them, this is apostasy. What we are considering right now, and the path we are moving in, there will be a very concerted attack from the environmental left, from academia, from the mainstream media, that will be attempting to tarnish and delegitimize the discussion that is happening. And frankly, I'm prepared for that. And you know what? I actually look forward to it, because this is an argument I know the people of this province are behind us on. Understanding that what we are looking at doing is in the best interests of our customers of SaskPower, but more broadly, this is in our provincial interest to be deeply considering what we are doing. And as far as support from the Premier, support from colleagues, there is no daylight. This is a government initiative. This is something that is, I would say, enthusiastically being supported by colleagues, fully understanding the impact. Because I think, Brian, you had pointed out in some of your commentary around these are going to be some of the most significant financial decisions that the province will make, if not the most significant financial decision that this province will make for decades to come. There are incredible, expenditures that would be required for, what the federal government would characterize as transition and all the rest of it, of which they have provided no resources, by the way. They have just dictated that this all has to be done at the cost of billions, if not, tens of billions of dollars, if they were to have their way, with absolutely no support in doing it. So what we have determined to do is what is best for the people here, and that will be done without regard to federal government positioning on these things. It will be done purely on the basis of our legitimate constitutional authority to make decisions in this space, and that's what we're going to do.
I just want to point out here that we've got 65 people watching already, and anyone who is watching live, if you go in the comment section below, or if you want to tweet or wherever it is, anything you say on there will show up here, and we can choose to interact with those if you have something valuable to add to the conversation. I wanted to point out here, and I did a story on this, the day after you were down here at Estevan speaking to the municipal leaders and speaking to the people at Boundary Dam, I sat down with the Reeve of the Arm of Estevan, Jason LeBlanc, and the newly elected mayor, Tony Cernick. When Tony was a councillor, he started a little one-person campaign called Save the Bass, where he was handing out buttons to everyone that said Save the Bass, because we have wide-mouthed bass in Boundary Dam Reservoir because of the heat from the power station. You lose the power station, you lose the fish, because they can't otherwise survive in Saskatchewan. And I kind of bugged him about it for years. I'm like, Tony, that's kind of ridiculous. But his point was that people care more about fish than they do about people's jobs. So if we can save the fish, we can save the jobs. And the ironic thing is that what's happening in California right now is because of some smelt, they didn't have water to cut the fire or fight fires with. But the other thing I want to touch on is that Jason LeBlanc, before he was Reeve of the Arm of Estevan, in 2019, he was part of a big convoy that went from Alberta and Saskatchewan to Ottawa, and he set up his semi right at the gate of Parliament. And they blew their horn, and they made a big stink about fighting the Trudeau government's energy policies, including the carbon tax, including shutting down coal. And the parliamentary police, under the orders of a government, obviously, would not allow them on the broad, snow-cleared sidewalks. They had to stand in 1 or 2 feet of snow in the grass of Parliament, because that's the only place they were allowed. So Jason stood up there and did a speech on a little platform in the middle of a snowbank, talking about all of this. So these people have been fighting for it for a long time. It's important. And, it was so refreshing to have lunch with them that last Friday. And, to see that if you carry through, I mean, this isn't guaranteed yet, but if you carry through, this is a huge win. I want to point out that if you do proceed both at Cornac and at Estevan of some form of rejuvenation, that saves at least 1,000 direct jobs, which each pay at least around 100,000 or much more. That saves 3 power plants, 2 communities, and 2 mines. I mean, the impact of that is hundreds of millions of dollars.
Yeah, well, no, absolutely. And I mean, Jason has been a huge proponent, and I've had some really good discussion directly with Jason and the council as well at the Arm of Estevan last week, and with Mayor Cernick and his council as well. And they've just been great in making the case. And what I underlined in a lot of those discussions about what is coming, though, which is going to be really a concerted and significant attack from kind of some of the groups that I had talked about earlier. But we're going forward on this process right now. But you're right. I mean, there are 1,000 direct jobs. There are many more that are indirectly tied, orders of multiple over that 1,000. But I look at it kind of holistically as well, as far as SaskPower is concerned. We have a workforce, a very, very skilled workforce that have been doing this work with a huge degree of success for a long time. They know what they are doing. We have transmission capacity that is in place, that is existing, that has been invested in by the people of Saskatchewan through SaskPower for a very long time as well, and has been maintained to a very high standard. We own the fuel source. We own the resource. One of the things I know you had talked to me about, or asked me about prior, Brian, in other interviews was, as far as the royalty. I mean, we own this fuel source. It is existent within literally kilometers of the facilities in which it is consumed to produce power. The amount of royalties that we pay is there's a couple of elements to it. There's a freehold element and a royalty element, but in the mid $20 million range over the last number of years on coal royalties. So we really, this is our resource. This is the people of Saskatchewan's resource, where, looking at alternative fuel sources, natural gas being an obvious one, we're paying what is going to be a commodity price, which is likely to go up. I think it was about $3.80. I didn't look at what the price was today, but it was something like $3.80. That price is likely to go up. And we've seen wild fluctuations in that price over the last 15, 20 years as well. Between 2 and 12, it moves very significantly based on a whole bunch of factors. So, another element that we've gone into.
Actually, before you do, I want to get into the coal royalties thing here, because I think this is part of the argument that no one else has really glommed onto. I started digging into this around 2019, and SaskPower was not helpful in giving me information on this. And finally, Laurie Carr dug it up for me back in 2019. Perhaps you have new numbers. But in 2019, we paid something like 30, because we own almost all the coal, we pay ourselves the royalty. So, and because we own the power plants and because we own the utility, we, the people, own the coal, we own the utility, and we sell it to ourselves. So it's like having your own garden. Yeah. And if you have your own garden and you go plant your carrots and you harvest your own carrots, you're not charging yourself much for the carrots, are you? Maybe for the carrot seed. Now, we pay about $1/3 billion, so $296 million last year for coal mining it. So we pay Westmoreland to mine it, and that pays for my neighbors' jobs and stuff like that. But the royalties are next to nothing. They're almost free. So do you have recent numbers of how much we collected in royalties last year?
I do. So on average in the last 2 years, between the freehold component and the royalty component, it's about $25 million. So they've gone down for obvious reasons since 2019, and that we're using less coal than we were in 2019. But really, the way you characterize it, I think, is exactly right, though, Brian. This is a resource that we own, that we, basically are paying royalties, very limited royalties to ourselves on. We're paying for the cost of the mining, which, as you pointed out, is about $1/3 billion. Whereas we are paying for right now the gas situation. We're importing, depending on the day, and there's some reasons why it fluctuates, between 80 to 90% of the gas that is being burned in SaskPower facilities is being imported. I wish we were producing more, but our geology is not the same as it is in some of our surrounding jurisdictions. So that is a real challenge. But that being said, we are importing this commodity. So talking about even the components of energy security, of which I think Europe has got a abject lesson since 2022.
Mhm.
Who are importing natural gas from Russia, not utilizing their own resources, and really had outsourced to Russia that fuel source. It came home to them very, very clearly what that means when you are giving up the control of your fuel source for your power generation. There can be very real implications. And, partly I think that there's a discussion going on right now, probably more specific to oil, that underlines that very same thing, that when you are not in control of your own destiny on these things, you are subject to a whole bunch of events that can happen, that you are going to be at the mercy of. And the fact that because of our coal generation mix is a part of that mix, it will decrease the risk in a broader energy security context in a very real way as well.
Mhm.
So I want to get into this before we get away from this, because I think it's really important. You touched about getting that much gas from Alberta. And it kind of relates to the whole trade thing of Trump right now, in that we've only drilled about 10 natural gas wells in Saskatchewan in the last decade.
Yeah.
Our domestic gas production is almost all from oil production, and it's not much. Our total gas volume produced in the last 12 years has dropped by well over half. I looked at that just the other day here from Energy and Resources, or I would say it's about half, sorry. So the reality is every dollar that we spend on natural gas to fuel our natural gas power plants at Swift Current, at Moose Jaw, soon to be at Lanigan, at North Battleford and Ermine and Saskatoon, that's a dollar that leaves the province and doesn't come back. So to use the garden analogy, instead of growing our own carrots, we're going to the store, we're buying the carrots from someone out of province, and we don't get that money back.
Yeah. And I would take it even further. I mean, using that analogy, we are entirely subject to the vagaries of where those carrots are being grown as to what that cost is going to be. But we still actually have to buy the carrots. So, having the ability to actually, have that own garden of your own, where you're actually growing the carrots, that is a huge, huge difference. So, with regard to the cost of fuel of natural gas, I think a lot of those who have, done some analysis in this space and, have determined that, gas might be, highly competitive right now, but we actually don't know what the cost of that fuel source is going to be over the next 30 years. I've told some of our officials that, if we were able to project the price of gas over 30 years, whoever is doing that projection should not probably be working for us. They should be on a commodities desk trading that in New York. And, it's entirely inherently unpredictable. So what I think, though, is kind of clear on the macro sense is that the price is likely to go up. I mean, that's the way these things have worked. And particularly, who I, openly hope to be Prime Minister very soon, Pierre Poilievre, the sooner the better. One of the commitments that the Conservatives have made very, very clearly is making sure that we can build energy infrastructure and get our resources and commodity to market, to Tidewater, which is a good thing. I mean, that's all very, very positive. But once we have that energy infrastructure in place and are able to export gas off the West Coast or the East Coast, wherever it may be, that is going to mean we are not getting a landlocked price, which has been a preferential price that we have been getting here in Saskatchewan. So all that again adds up to this overall matrix of energy security and the importance of having a diversified power production mix, using your own resources as much as you possibly can.
So I just want to jump in
I
here.
get to say something, Brian.
I just want to say here, Bronwyn, I wanted you to take over here in a second, but the fact that LNG Canada is going to go online in months, and it's going to explode, right? We've had the natural gas prices around $2 for about 15 years. And when LNG Canada goes up, it's going to have an impact on our prices. You just alluded to. It's not going to go down. It could double, could triple. And because all that money is going to be going to Alberta, it's going to have a huge impact.
Well, I mean, that's absolutely right. I mean, and on top of that, there are a whole bunch of other things that could be happening with regard to, natural gas production and natural gas transportation infrastructure. They're going to have an impact on that price. So, all of that, again, adds up to the fact that having control of our own energy fuel supply is an important part of providing energy security for people here in this province and making sure that their power rates over the long term and their power generation is reliable and affordable. And that really is the lens through which we're looking at it.
I mean, one thing I was going to say, I think that it's a shame it's been so long coming in terms of the Crowns, just with all respect to the whole system that's evolved over the last few years, because precious time has been wasted, when it comes to their having played along for as long as they have in some ways with those federal policies. And, now this is it's a healthy change and helpful on all fronts. But again, it's a shame that there's been, the amount of time that's gone by, with adherence to some of these federal policies for as long as has been the case. That said, I think that in terms of the timing, it is everything. I mean, hopefully we see a change, as you were saying, Jeremy, federally, but as long as the Liberals were in power, I mean, one of the reasons that we did Sask First, of course, was to arm ourselves with the sort of the line in the sand on 92A. And we had to do that because they would have no doubt come after us on coal. I mean, that was, they had interfered from the environmental perspective, trying to claim that was a federal power. It's a very gray area, but they had come after us for that. And we had to really reassert the provincial jurisdiction in this area. So it is actually, it's been a long time coming, but I think now with the federal government in the chaos that they're in, they're unlikely to, take us to task or launch a war, economically or otherwise, jurisdictionally or otherwise, on coal. So it's very good timing to do what we're doing. I also think just interesting on the geopolitics of this and the timing. I mean, Trump yesterday, as you'll both know, was talking when he was beamed into Davos in Switzerland about coal, and he said, he's sending some interesting signals. He said, nothing can destroy coal, not the weather, not a bomb. It's a great backup. And of course, as we know, it is a great backup. But interestingly, one of the connections that he seems to be making is on AI data centers, which is a little bit of a remote thing seemingly, but actually, as we know, they require an enormous amount of power. And he's been casting about for, where this can come from. And, the federal government, our federal government, has talked about powering AI data centers with green energy. What could possibly go wrong? Coal is clearly looking, or Trump is clearly looking at coal. So interesting timing in light of just the chaos theory of coal, of Trump rather, the chaos theory of the federal government right now in terms of stepping now into this gap, if you like, Minister, and saying, okay, we're reasserting ourselves and we really can't do much about this.
Well, I think, Bronwyn, I would say, I think a lot of things have really come together to make the direction that we're going in not just feasible, but really, I think, very much supported by the public here in the province. And the feds, are they going to come after us? I don't know. I mean, it really doesn't matter at this point. Everything they do is kind of written in invisible ink right now. So, they may. I'm sure Guibert and Wilkinson are going to be, up in arms and angry and writing, letters to me and to the government. But I mean, whatever. I mean, we like I've said earlier, they really have no standing in any of this discussion, and we've done the groundwork to get to the point in saying that they have no standing. Sask First Act being a big part of that. I think other elements of this, from a highly kind of technically legal perspective, and Bronwyn, you did a lot of the work on this as well. They really undermine the ratio de sedendi in the greenhouse gas emissions case. They really undermined the very narrow grounds on which the Supreme Court ruled in their favor on that decision, which was really centered around the national concern branch of the peace, order, and good government provision, so Section 1 of the 1867 Constitution. The reason and to use the lawyer's language between Bronwyn and I, the reason that they actually made that determination was based on a national structure for a national program. When the federal government made the decision for highly political reasons to exempt home heating fuel in Atlantic Canada, it undermined the entire rationale by which the Supreme Court said they had the authority to move forward with their carbon pricing framework. The entire authority. I suspect when this is reconsidered at some point in the future, it will very likely be decided differently based on the fact that that was overturned. So the specifics of the greenhouse gas pricing system that were put in place were undermined entirely by what they did. And that was a relatively recent development. We had responded by then exempting home heating fuel here in Saskatchewan, which has resulted in initially Minister Duncan being a registered distributor of natural gas. Now I have the honor, I'm going to put it on my business card, I think, registered distributor of natural gas. But that was so that was our response to all of that. And as far as what's driving,
Jeremy, are you going to be the sacrifice on the cross of the carbon cross, I guess it is?
Well, if anybody's going to carbon jail, that would be I. So I've told my wife, she's like, "Are you really sure about that?" I'm like, "Well, I've heard carbon jail's not that tough of a place, so I guess we'll see."
So we're just going to take a brief break here, folks, for our sponsor, and we're going to come back. We have a lot more to discuss. We've got, obviously, Trump just came up. We've got some stuff about his executive orders. We want to talk nuclear, interties. So stick around for a little bit. There's a reason that HG Jack has dominated Saskatchewan's oil patch. That's because that distinctive curved walking beam reduces energy consumption by about 25%. That means 25% less power bills, 25% less carbon tax. That's a big difference. And it's available exclusively from Grimes Sales and Service, Batman, Saskatchewan. And we're back, and we have 102 people viewing right now, and we've had some comments come in, and we've been showing them on the screen, some of them here. I wanted to get into nuclear because the Premier came to Estevan here in May and said that if we are going to build nuclear, first one will be here at Estevan, either at Boundary Dam or at Rafferty. Now, I was there when Minister Morgan, your predecessor, first said that we were looking at seriously at building nuclear, building the General Electric Hitachi BWRX 300, which stands for the 10th generation General Electric boiling water reactor, 300 megawatt size, which is the size of Shand Power Station or one of the units at Poplar River or Boundary Dam 6. So at the time, I asked how much is going to cost, because no one bothered to mention it during the press conference. And the Minister of Energy from Ontario, which we're teamed up with Ontario Power Generation, said, well, they're looking at about $2 to $3 billion. And Don Morgan from Saskatchewan said, but they could be 3 to 5. And the Ontario minister said, whoa, but we think it's going to be 2 to 3 million. And Morgan said, yeah, but it could be 3 to 5. And right now they've started some basic construction on the first unit at Darlington. The second company to build these was supposed to be the Tennessee Valley Authority. And I think they had some information recently about the cost. Can you speak to that at all?
Yeah, sure. No, I can, Brian. And I actually read that TVA or Tennessee Valley Authority report here in the last couple of days. I would say this by way of a preamble. I am a huge supporter of nuclear. I'm from northern Saskatchewan. A large number of my constituents work directly in the uranium mining industry and associated components to that. So I am a huge supporter of nuclear. I've been a huge supporter of how we can develop this technology and the supply chain here in Saskatchewan, which is really where I think there can be some tremendous value. All that being said, what we have seen historically with nuclear has been that it probably is going to take longer than you hope it to, and it's probably going to cost more than you hope it will. So, that is remaining to be seen, although the TVA report adjusted upwards their cost estimate of the reactor. And they had initially estimated, I think, about $5 billion, which had been what we had hoped it would cost, to about 7.5, and that was done in the last couple of weeks. The Ontario Power Generation is going to have their Class 3 estimate in the next couple of months. So hopefully by April, we'll get the Class 3s from OPG, which is a range. It's a -20 +30 range on a Class 3 cost estimate. I honestly don't know what the answer from OPG is going to be, but all of these things are going to factor into long-term decisions and timelines. So what we really wanted to be in a position, though, to do is, part of that long-term power mix and redundancy is going to mean we have the capacity to adjust for changes in either timeframes or other things. And that has definitely been an element of consideration. All that being said, I mean, I hope that we end up with a 2029 decision point for SaskPower on SMR deployment. I hope it's in the cost range that we expected it to be. I would love to see large-scale SMR deployment, but it has to make economic sense for our ratepayers and customers at SaskPower, our industrial and commercial customers as well. It has to make sense in the broader mix of the alternatives. I would say this, I mean, I have not closed the door to large-scale nuclear either. And, we have Westinghouse, who have multiple AP1000s that are now operational around the world. I think there are, literally dozens more that are on order. So a technology that is, getting close to mature. The X's, I talk about the X's in the equations. I mean, there's a lot of X's in the equation on SMR yet. A lot of those X's have been answered, though, with numbers on large-scale nuclear. So, we're going to be going through all of that as a part of the long-term future. By 2050, I would love to get to the point where we have a majority of our baseload power generation being done through nuclear power generation. I think it makes sense, given the fact that the uranium, which powers many of these units around the world, literally comes out of the ground here in this province. I would love to have a supply chain that would go along with that, from just the mining, to production and all points in between. But those are questions that are going to have to be answered, and a lot of work is going to have to go into. And I give our partners credit on this. The SMA, SIMSA have done some great work on this. We had a symposium with the Canadian Nuclear Association just a few days ago in Saskatoon, and a lot of work is going into this. But the X's in the equation are not yet answered, but the government's overall policy direction to get to nuclear power generation remains unaltered as quickly as we can get there, and as it makes economic sense. Oh, you're on mute, Brian.
Sorry, I keep doing that. I just want to point out that the that price that you just mentioned, up to 7.5 for one reactor, we would need 5 reactors, not one, of that size to replace just our coal fleet. That doesn't count for any growth. That's just to replace the existing coal fleet as it is. Bronwyn, you want to jump in here?
Well, I guess, one of the things that I always said, and when we're talking about the bridge from coal to nuclear, is exactly that it's a bridge, and was it, always portrayed and presented as a bridge. And I think any security around, coal and all that you're signaling, I think is really important when it comes to addressing that. I mean, to the point about it's being a backup, and where there's more security in that regard, it's a good thing, because otherwise the narrative was always, we're phasing out coal because we've been told we have to. And then we're, the bridge is natural gas. And then, of course, the feds didn't like that, as we know, because that, fossil fuel. And then we're bridging to nuclear. And so it's just that the way this narrative now is falling into place, where, there's more security around coal. And yes, the natural gas remains a very important bridge. Yes, some renewables, but I think in terms of the uranium, nuclear conversation, it's good to know. And I know we have talked about this before, the fact that, it's SMRs probably, but not completely discounted, is the idea of a larger, unit or station or something. And I know that is less untested, as we all know, when we look around the world. So, I mean, it's that crucial bridge. And, you mentioned the geopolitics earlier, Jeremy, in Europe. I mean, you look at Germany, for example, where they shut down nuclear after Fukushima. They hedged all their bets, or most of their bets, 40% on natural gas from Russia. That was bad. That didn't work out well. So then they, looked at all the wind they had, and it was uniquely windless one winter, and they had to fire up coal. That's just not where we want to be. And I think we're all on the same page on that. And so I think really going back to the beginning of the conversation about, why coal and what we're signaling is so important for that sense of security, especially as these kind of geopolitical winds are changing.
Yeah, no, a very good observation. And, I would say this. I mean, with regard, this is actually a major issue in the German election campaign right now, which historically between California and Germany have really been kind of icons, I think, for folks that would look at what they would hope a power generation future might look like. Well, Germany found out. I mean, as you well pointed out, having 40% of their gas cut off from Russia, which Russia used as a geopolitical tool to leverage policy outcomes from and geopolitical stances from Germany, which they hope to leverage on Ukraine. So there are much bigger implications to this than just what your power matrix looks like, which I kind of have gone back to a couple of times in that energy security part of this discussion. But the large scale and a micro reactor or modular reactor discussion. I mean, this is going to be a continuing one, and it will be resolved within the context of what is best for the province. And it's really interesting. I'm not sure outside of certain policy interest people in this province how well known it is, but the fact that Westinghouse is a 49% Saskatchewan-owned company. Cameco is a genuine giant around the world as far as power generation, nuclear servicing, running a huge fleet of reactors around the world. A company that literally is 49% owned by our very own Saskatchewan Cameco. So, the competitors in that large scale space obviously will be SNC-Lavalin, who have been in that space with their CANDU products. Who are aggressively marketing around the world their Monarch design, which has not been built and which has not been licensed. They're going through a process of all of that, and we will open to having the discussion for sure. And we've met with their representatives at different levels. But all that being said, we have a nuclear giant right here in Saskatchewan that has global reach and has done a fantastic job. I really want to see though more of the supply chain on nuclear be here in this province and leveraging the work that Cameco and its position in Westinghouse do. Government are going to work with those companies to try and bring some of that home.
So I wanted to touch on that because I was at a supply chain event that SIMSA hosted for Westinghouse in November in Saskatoon about them wanting to start building components of reactors here in Saskatchewan. I think it can't be understated that Cameco, being one of Saskatchewan's corporate darlings, now owning 49% of Westinghouse. I mean, of the major reactor builders in the world, in the Western world, you have General Electric and Westinghouse, who basically created the industry in the United States. You have SNC-Lavalin, which is now called Atkins Realis because their name is so sullied they don't want to call themselves SNC anymore, which has taken over the AECL CANDU reactor. You have Energy de France, which is building the reactors in England right now, and most of France is powered by nuclear. And that's pretty much it. And if you're a Saskatchewan premier, Saskatchewan government, and you choose a Quebec company over a Saskatchewan-owned company, even though those reactors weren't designed here and built there, it's now partially owned here. That's almost political suicide to choose SNC over something that is half Cameco owned.
Well, I mean, I would just kind of say, I mean, there is a whole lot of things that will happen between now and any kind of selection of reactor designs in that space. But the point I made earlier, and you made as well, Brian, about the home-based nature of Cameco and their relationship and ownership interest in Westinghouse, obviously, is not an insignificant one. So. Westinghouse are, obviously a Pittsburgh corporate headquarter based company, which has, I think, provided them some advantages in how they have been able to market globally. I was in Poland, I don't know, about a year or so ago, maybe a year and a half ago, and met with both of their nuclear operators who, are in the market for deploying nuclear into that jurisdiction. And where they ultimately landed was with Westinghouse, and there are a number of reasons for that. But we have a technology there that's been deployed globally. It'll all be a part, though, as we move forward here in Saskatchewan about the next steps as we bridge to nuclear. As Bronwyn pointed out, that's the objective, bridging to nuclear and getting there in a way that is, as rapid as it can be, but also as cost effective as it can be.
So back on the carbon, I want to get back to coal and carbon capture. Bronwyn, you fought this battle quite a bit as Energy and Resources Minister, and Jeremy, if you can talk a bit about how carbon capture plays into this, because if we do build coal, and I just want to pull up the picture here, that's the carbon capture unit at Boundary Dam 3. One of the options we can do is we could add carbon capture, and if we did it on, let's say, Boundary Dam 6 and Shand, my back of the table napkin math is that could increase our oil production by ballpark 50,000 barrels. Now, I could be out a bit, but that's based on what's happening right now at the Weyburn unit using the CO2 from this plant and from Beulah, North Dakota. Yeah. How does this factor in? First, I'll start with Bronwyn and then Jeremy into this whole discussion, because Bronwyn, you were definitely, as Energy and Resources, this was part of your portfolio.
Well, I mean, the enhanced oil recovery discussion aside, I mean, that is true. Your back of the napkin math, there'd be, with any CCUS, yes, it can benefit, through the enhanced oil recovery, as I say, side of things. But I mean, just on the economics of it, I mean, if we go with more coal and certainly built more out or added more on, and I'd like to hear what Jeremy has to say, but I would say no CCUS. I mean, it's been expensive. It was expensive. And certainly when we look at the conversation around CCUS, I mean, let's look at the oil sands. Part of the reason that the oil sands took the position they did, which was to placate the federal government for as long as they did, was because they were desperate for funds from the federal government for CCUS. It is a very, very expensive proposition. Is there a byproduct good side or okay side to it? Absolutely, through enhanced oil recovery. But I think that's something, would be very interesting to dissect. I mean, the real microeconomics of that one, in terms of, going that road because it might benefit EOR. I just don't see it. I think if we're going to go coal, then go coal and build up coal. Absolutely. But I think that the CCUS side has been economically fraught at best with some certainly okay byproducts, but that's been more necessity than desire.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, what I have said, and what I'll say again here is, we will consider CCUS. We will consider it as a part of what that future refurbishment would look like, but it will be considered in the context of what makes economic sense for the province. So incremental recovery of oil, I mean, we've been clear. I mean, we have a 1 million barrel a day objective to reach. That's a big hill to climb, right? I mean, we're at 500,000 barrels right now, so we want to double oil production here in Saskatchewan, which means we're going to have to take a look at a whole number of different measures to progress toward that target. I think CCS could be a part of that, but we are going to have to make sure that it makes sense as far as the increased economic activity in a macro context, and the royalty implications for increased oil recovery, the commercial relationships that may exist as far as the offtakes. All of those things will have to be considered as a part of a decision on CCS. I would say, with regard to the technology itself, that I think we have got to a point where we have a very good understanding of the actual technical elements around this. We had a 85% availability last year on the carbon capture boundary dam unit, which has been a challenge. I mean, this was a first of a kind technology that definitely, there's a significant learning curve for SaskPower, and a significant investment that went into that facility. In combination with the Harper government made some significant financial commitments to that, but we also put in very significant provincial resources as well. So the numbers will have to make sense. I'm not going to rule it out. I'm not going to rule it in, but it will be determined on what actually makes economic sense for the province in a macro sense.
And I think just to add to that, quickly, with CCUS, at its root, CCUS was a result of, again, going right back to the beginning again, top-down federal impositions. And it's bound up in that. And the economics of it have always been tricky. So if we're freed from that, I would say we should celebrate that and kind of move on. And I take your point, Minister, and I know that's something, but my goodness, in the last few years, we've been treated to, the federal government basically saying that, they'll only allow us to do natural gas power if we add on, CCS. That is totally untested, has never been at scale. And, SaskPower has said would cost upward of God knows. It's an incredibly expensive proposition. So I think, if one can start to move away from that toward the pure economics, I think it's probably a positive thing. On the coal economics. One thing you'll have heard, I've heard, Minister Duncan, Minister Morgan before that will have heard, for years, was that companies aren't interested in our pursuing coal because of their environmental and other obligations, direction, so they're really not looking at coal anymore. I was told countless times because of the implications of that, ideological, in other words, to their bottom line, right? So we've always been told, well, people won't invest in them, or they won't be able to get money, from banks or governments or whatever, if they push for or are public about supporting coal. But now, with the geopolitical change and even what you're signaling, I've never believed for a moment that companies, when confronted with cheap power, will ever say no to that and will actually want to pursue the most expensive option, right? So I just find it, really liberating, great, positive that there's this sort of nudging in this new direction or renewed direction, that we're maybe seeing change on all these fronts, because it's really overdue.
On the economics there's one thing that actually, in getting ready for this, I was going through the SaskPower annual report that came out last summer. And I was actually astonished. I didn't pick up on this earlier. So I was at the Great Plains power station opening in December, and it's a 377 megawatt natural gas fired combined cycle facility. It's a brand new. Took my son there actually to show it, because I want him to build reactors or coal plants or whatever as an electrician. He graduates this summer, and hopefully in time for you guys to do that, he'll be working on those. Great Plains cost $825 million, according to the annual report. We're going to be building one near Lanigan, which will be very close to the BHP Jansen mine and largely to support that. Basically a clone of Moose Jaw's Great Plains, but instead of $825 million, its total cost is now projected 1.4 to 1.7 billion. That's potentially 1.5 times to almost double of its clone just a couple years later. Can you speak to that, Minister?
Yeah, there absolutely has been inflation in construction projects right across the board, and that's reflected in those price differences. That's why yesterday we saw, and you reported on it, Brian, an announcement of a combined cycle nat gas facility, 1,400 megawatt facility just across the border in North Dakota, and they were estimating that 1,400 megs would be at $4 billion, and I was thinking, well, good luck with that. Because the cost will end up being, significantly higher than that. There are pressures throughout the entire system, not unrelated to some of the affordability issues that are impacting the rest of the economy, of which the carbon tax is a significant part of all of it. So all of that is a part of what we're looking at. And people don't remember this actually anymore who are outside of the industry, but we actually have done this before. I mean, as far as coal refurbishment, rebuilds. I mean, we did this at Boundary Dam 3. It's kind of looked at in the context of the broader CCUS project, but as a part of that, there was actually a complete refurbishment of that unit. And that unit refurbishment cost a little over $500 million. And that was in 2014, so 10 years ago. I mean, costs are going to have increased. But that all being said, SaskPower know how to do this. It has been done before. We understand the implications of doing it and how to do it. So, that's going to be a big part of what we are working through right now. And I can tell you, I'm keeping kind of a daily handle on what we're working through as well. We went through a number of these things yesterday. I'm not kind of in a spot to put out numbers because we really are making sure we get all of that right. But all that to say is I'm pretty confident that the economics are going to look good on moving on coal refurbishment. What had been highly distortionary in all of this, though, had been the Part 2 electricity carbon tax. That's really what had been highly distortionary in what otherwise would have been market-based decisions, which the U.S. have been making, by the way, without these kind of distortionary elements included in them all the way along. So, what I've heard from the Conservatives has been that they are getting rid of the carbon tax, that there hasn't been a asterisk on, but we're going to keep some of it. I have not heard that. So, if provinces are given the authority, which they rightfully have, I mean, this is where the authority should reside if they wish to do a heavy emitters or output-based system. And some provinces were. I mean, Alberta had instituted one before Trudeau formed government. British Columbia had. Ontario and Quebec had a cap and trade thing. I mean, for us, it would make no sense. Obviously, we're not going to have tax our electricity generation. There would be no point. It would be, again, us taxing ourselves. So you remove the heavy emitter output-based tax on our electricity generation. Well, I mean, I think I have a pretty good picture of where the economics are going to go.
Do you mind if we stick around for a couple more minutes, because we're just at the hour here? There's two more things I want to talk about: interties and, of course, Trump.
Right.
So, are you okay with that, Jeremy?
I am, absolutely. Yeah, for sure.
Okay, so on interties here, because you just referenced this, and that was my lead story for this morning. Just yesterday afternoon, Basin Electric, which is the electric cooperative that covers Western North Dakota, announced a 1,470 megawatt 2-unit combined cycle natural gas power plant just 20 kilometers northeast of Williston, right in the very heart of the Bakken, where they flare so much gas that Peter Zion, in his speeches for the last almost 10 years, has always shown a satellite image of North Dakota glowing at night from the space station because of how much they've been flaring. So lots of gas they're basically wasting that they're going to incorporate into this. And it also happens to be almost precisely 80 kilometers straight south of the intertie, which Saskatchewan's is already started construction on. That's going to cost us about $1 billion, give or take. I was originally very critical of the intertie because it seemed that by buying power from Southwest Power Pool whenever we did, because at any given time sometimes they're 44% wind, but sometimes they're 40% coal. And why would we want to give up our coal plants to buy coal power from North Dakota? Now, if we're going to keep our coal plants, then I'm not so concerned about that. But the other thing is that this power plant, if we do buy power from North Dakota, because it will be the closest one on the grid to us, other than some, wind turbines just south of Estevan, almost guaranteed most of the power that we would be getting would be coming from that plant if we're bringing in power from the United States. Some wind, yeah, but because of just the way it is, electrons don't care where they're generated. They go from the closest place to the furthest place. The other thing, and I'll get into frequency in a bit. Can you talk about that first?
No, I can, Brian. And, I would say firstly, with regard to the intertie. So moving to and constructing a 600 megawatt intertie, I think there are going to be real there's going to be real advantages to that going both ways. But really, I've talked about this in the context of what our opportunity looks like as a energy generation exporter. I mean, I really want to get to the point where we are in a position to export power we're producing to other provinces and to the United States, to the Southern Power Pool. I think it makes sense. The fact that there is a additional generation capacity coming online in North Dakota, there is going to be, and you look at the projections for power usage going forward, they are enormous. And, the president has talked about data centers. Well, I mean, these are massively power intensive units. I've heard from, our neighbors to the west, for example, about their interest in having these massive data centers. Well, I don't know where they're going to get their power from because where Alberta is at right now, I mean, our intertie had been utilized on a number of occasions. We're wheeling power into Alberta. So I'm not sure where they're going to actually get their power from to attract any of these investments.
Good point.
If we have another 1,000+ megawatts of generation on the grid that we're able to either export or use for our own purposes here in this province, it opens up a lot of economic opportunities. And we will be in a position to have these discussions with AI data centers who, frankly, I mean, we have a real advantage in this space because power is their biggest expense. And what the power is used for is cooling. But look out the window on any given day in January or February, we have a competitive advantage in that it is cold here. So this is why a lot of these this is why data centers are actually looking at northern climates for where they locate. But you actually have to have the grid capacity to accommodate those same units when it is 20 above outside and not 20 below. So that's a big part of I think why we're going to have real economic benefit from having more power on the grid and able to produce more than we thought. But in the United States, I mean, I know we're going to get to it. I'll leave comments for that. But I mean, there are revolutionary changes. I read through the president's executive orders that he issued on January 20th, and the implications of those EOs, I think, have been really underplayed. They are hugely significant, but I'll leave it there.
So, Bronwyn, I'm going to tee you up on that here.
Yeah, well, no, I mean, just first of all, on the grid thing, I mean, absolutely agree with, and I know Kevin texted in here, coal all the way. I mean, that Alberta has had blackouts. We had to provide power to Alberta just a year ago. My son was in a hotel banquet room in Edmonton and the lights literally went out. It is a nebulous situation there, and we have a stronger grid. And so when we're talking about these AI data centers, and I know Kevin O'Leary has been really pitching Alberta to the Trump to the Trump administration, but it's interesting because when you read O'Leary on this, and he's the big hawk for these data centers in Alberta, he has to acknowledge that they've had these blackouts and grid challenges. He also acknowledges, interestingly, that the U.S. power grid is tapped out, as he puts it. So, step in, Saskatchewan. I absolutely hope that we can play host to these data centers because, by and large, we've played it smart. I mean, we could have, as I said earlier, we could have maybe fought on the coal front, a little bit sooner. But if we do it now, to Trump's point about, it's being an amazing backup, it is. And I think that we're very, very well positioned because what we're seeing everywhere else, whether it's Texas or Alberta and down the line, is a very vulnerable grid. And, just thank you, green climate policies. They have brought us to the brink, and we have to now build out of this, and I think we both agree, Jeremy, that we're in a pretty good position, increasingly good position in terms of this.
I got to get on my Apple card here, or my Apple box, because I have been beating this drum really hard for the last 3 years. It was Christmas time 3 years ago. I'm sitting at my mom's place. I'm like, what am I going to write about? Oh, what news is all about? It's going to be the coldest day of the year. And just for giggles, I looked up the Alberta power grid. Never did that before. And at that time, Alberta had 2,700 megawatts and change of wind. And it's nighttime, so there's no solar production. And I'm watching the numbers go down until it hit 2 megawatts out of 2,700. It was less than 0.1% output. And I had this revelation. The federal government is telling us, the whole society is telling us, thou shalt build wind and solar, and it will be your salvation. And the reality is that it was a false god. There's no way we can power our society when our major thing goes to zero. And in the past 3 years, what happened was Alberta got rid of its last coal plants. They converted them to natural gas or shut them down. They've more than doubled their wind capacity. So now they're at over 5,600 megawatts of wind, at 1,800 megawatts of solar. So they've doubled that in 3 years. And in that time, they this time last year, I was almost to the day, they were going into grid alerts, as Bronwyn mentioned, and they actually, I think it was in February, they went into rolling blackouts. And the point I have been hammering home in editorials and in emails and everything else is that, number one, Alberta has more coal, oil, and natural gas than God, because God gave all of his to Alberta. We got the leftovers. And any jurisdiction that can screw that up and go into blackouts it's total utter incompetence at the top. So why are we throwing away what we know works, coal and natural gas, for wind and solar? That's been a driving part of why I've been writing over 100 stories about this for the last 3 years.
And I think part of that is the centralization of SaskPower. I mean, the fact that Alberta has become this sort of crazy patchwork in the utility sphere. I mean, credit where credit is due to just the system we have in place. We're lucky. We're lucky because if you look at the US patchwork and you look at the Alberta patchwork and the cost implications, the safety implications, the rest of it, I mean, we are well placed because we have the central crown.
Yeah, I mean, Alberta's a really interesting case study with where they're at. I mean, we actually just this has not been publicly announced yet, but we put the intertie, which had been down for a whole bunch of maintenance purposes, but we have it back online right now for emergency purposes. And so if we have to wheel power to Alberta, we'll be in a position to do that, given the fact that, I mean, we could very well end up with a bunch of minus 40 days and Alberta could be in a spot. The other stuff, and it is a challenge with renewables. And I would say this, I said it at the beginning, I'm not anti-renewable, but we have to understand what renewables are. And we have to understand the economic context in which renewables exist. One of the very first things I worked on here was what that availability is for our renewables. And Brian, you pointed out, I mean, solar, when it's dark, it doesn't work, right? Or when it snows, it doesn't work. On wind, when the wind doesn't blow, it doesn't work. And so you're looking at a 5 to 10% availability on renewables. And what has made the economics attractive have been federal policies that either have directly subsidized the capital cost of these, or have manipulated the cost of alternatives by imposing taxation measures. I mean, that was the point. I mean, that was actually why the federal government embarked on the policy path that they did. They wanted to make it uneconomic and impossible to run non-renewable fuel sources. But I've said this as well. The Stone Age didn't end because they ran out of stones, and the fossil fuel age isn't going to end because we run out of fossil fuels. It will end because we find something that can stand on its own 2 feet, make sense from a market perspective, and will be more attractive for all kinds of reasons. And I think nuclear has very much the potential to be that fuel source, but the economics do have to work on that as well. But in the interim, where we are right now, we have to get there. And that really goes back to my central point and argument in all of this, is that we know what is going to bridge us there. We have that technology. We've been operating it at SaskPower for 7+ decades. We know how it works. And the reasons why it had been, kind of the direction it had been in was because of distortionary policy from federal government. So, we're going to do what's right. I mean, that's really what it comes down to. There are issues with renewables as well. I mean, Brian, you're kind of an expert in this, but you have the frequency variance issues, which are very real, which lead to times when the wind is really blowing quite hard. You have windmills that aren't operating, wind turbines that aren't operating because you have uncontrollable frequency variations, right? And that can cause huge issues in the grid that really could be catastrophic if not managed properly. So anyway, I'd leave that to you to explain in detail, Brian, but that's a real thing.
All right, I'm going to go into that very briefly here, just so people understand. And if you want to look this up on Pipeline Online in the search bar, just type in frequency. As I explained to the Premier when I had this conversation with him a few months ago about this, it's never an issue until it is. But if it does become an issue, it is the biggest issue you are facing at this moment. Because if the frequency of precisely 60.0 hertz varies by more than 0.5% for more than a few minutes, the entire grid goes down. Because individual generating units, individual switch stations are programmed such that if that frequency, that sine wave, goes out more than so much, they'll disconnect themselves to protect themselves, because otherwise they can blow themselves apart, quite literally. So then you end up with something called a blackout. What people usually refer to a blackout is not a blackout. It's actually more of what's called a brownout. A true blackout is there is nothing on the grid. And then you have to do something called a black start, where you have to bring in individual units on one at a time and only add a certain amount of load. Let's say you bring in one unit and you can only provide power to Estevan and Weyburn, but not Regina. Then you bring on another unit, you can provide a quarter of Regina. It takes days to weeks to make this happen. So it's something that usually we never think about because we have very smart people who've made this all work, and if base load power, it works. But Alberta has interties going to British Columbia, Montana, and Saskatchewan. And last fall, the Saskatchewan was still operating, but the ones in Montana and British Columbia were out. And what I didn't realize is that those interties to other parts of grids, it works like a giant shock absorber. It takes out a lot of these issues. But when they're down, as it happened in Alberta, they had something like almost 24 frequency variations in the space of 2 weeks. And some of them got pretty sketchy. And these are things that never get talked about, never get media attention. And if it does happen, God forbid it doesn't happen in the wintertime. Texas, when they had that big thing in February of 21, they were within 4 minutes and 37 seconds of losing the entire grid. And as it was, 300 people died because of the brownouts they had.
Yeah.
I do want to get into Trump here before we go, and we'll call it a day.
I have 2 rant points after that, really quick. Go ahead.
Jeremy on Trump.
Well, I kind of touched on it a little bit, but the executive orders that were issued, they were a lot of them. There were, a couple hundred that were issued on the 20th, but a number of them had very specifically to do with energy issues. And there was one on unleashing American energy, which had very, very significant and sweeping changes. Also, I would say even beyond what were promulgated, the rescission of the Biden era EOs was probably as or more consequential in that it's changed the entire landscape in which American energy producers and power operators are going to be considering their options going forward. So, there was a number. One had to do with offshore. One had to do with Alaska. There was a national energy emergency declaration, which had a number of implications as well through a number of different agencies. But basically, at the end of the day, what it means is there is going to be incredible authority for project approvals to go forward. Going to be extraordinary authorities granted through different branches of the U.S. government to move projects through stages or skip stages to get to construction. Lifted the Biden EO on a moratorium on LNG exports, which is going to put Canadian projects in significant jeopardy. This was an area where we had a huge advantage 5 years ago that was entirely squandered by the federal government, entirely squandered, which would have had geopolitical implications in that we could have been providing LNG to Europe, for example, but we're not. Instead, Trudeau's telling, Chancellor Schultz, there's no business case for this. You got to be kidding me, right? And, this is an opportunity that might be slipping away now for the entire country. So We are going to have to get really serious about this really quickly. I think even the existing Liberal government are going to be getting advice saying if you do not move and liberalize your policies, we could lose the entire industry. And to them, I mean, for a Guilbeault or a Wilkinson, they might say, fantastic, that's exactly what we've been trying to do. But, this is going to mean a Poilievre government are going to have to move very rapidly. Pierre, I saw yesterday or today, was talking about the complete repeal of C-69, which they need to do, but not only a repeal of C-69, but streamlining even of previously existing processes, which we well know, we're challenging enough. We need to get Energy East built. We need to get Northern Gateway built. This is kind of all of the above on the pipeline front, all of the above on project approval streamlining, or else we are not going to be competitive. And we are going to have to move very quickly on that in changing these things, or else capital will make the decision to redeploy, and Canada will be in a very, very problematic position. And I said, maybe the existing guys are happy about that, but this has massive implications for the standard of living of people here in this, not just in this part of Canada. This has massive implications for the standard of living in people in this country. And I think more and more so people have been noticing the fact that our standard of living comparative to the United States has been declining, and it has been. It quantifiably, our wealth in this country has been declining in comparison to the United States. That will massively accelerate given the policy trajectory that the United States is on right now. And unless we are prepared to massively and significantly overhaul all of these processes within Canada, we are going to continue to see that decline happening.
And we've got to stop having these very parochial conversations that we're having. One thing about Trump is he focuses us very, very quickly. And I mean, as a country, suddenly we're talking about the border, we're talking about NATO, we're talking about pipelines, we're talking about Northern Gateway and Energy East, and we're very focused. We should have been focused for the last 10 years. And I know, I'm preaching to the choir, but even as recently as this morning, we see, an op-ed in the Regina Leader Post Star Phoenix, talking, by an economics prof, no less. And it's just the same old arguments. It's Emily Eaton acolyte territory, and it's not the economics. The economics are that, going back to the original discussion point here on coal, this is about 1,000 jobs for the southeast of this province. This is about Coronach and the viability of Estevan and the viability of our power grid. That's the economics. And if we don't start having these broader geopolitical discussions in this province, and we don't allow more, debate and discussion around what really is at stake here, which we haven't really been having nationally either for the last 10 years, but now suddenly are, because, of this 51st governor state stuff that we keep hearing about and flying into a fit every time it's mentioned. That's called the art of the deal. It's called negotiation. And we are hamstrung coming to the table. We have really harmed ourselves as a nation. And I hope, to your point, Jeremy, about Poilievre and C-69, I do find that really hopeful. It does go back, to your point, though, about, and if I hear one more time that we can't do coal, what you're proposing on coal, or we can't do, our own thing when it comes to Sask First or in any other direction, because we lost the carbon tax case, again, time to have the real discussion about what that case stood for. It was that you had to use the trump card of peace, order, and good government, national concern. The Supreme Court justices said, absolutely, this does not give the federal government free rein to go after every single area of provincial jurisdiction, let alone carve them out. So, go for it on coal. And I hope that Poilievre really allows the provinces, if he's successful, that he allows the provinces to reassert their jurisdiction. Because if we hadn't been doing it and trying all this time, and Alberta, we would be even more harmed coming to the table now in light of what we're seeing. Look, the other executive order you didn't mention was Paris Accord, gone. Right. We've been basing all this stuff for 10 years on Paris and all the Redux Accords that no one can even follow anymore, and all the date lines and timelines, and they're all expired. They're over, So this is a whole new time, but anyway, really, very pleased about the announcement, which is what we started talking about off the top.
I do want to get in on the pipeline thing here, because obviously it's Pipeline Online. I used to build pipelines. And you mentioned Energy East, and my God, I'm sure that Premier Mo was getting sick of me even a couple of years ago, still mentioning it. He was probably the last reporter in the country asking a politician about Energy East.
Mm.
And now yesterday, the Premier of New Brunswick, or sorry, Nova Scotia says, maybe we should build Energy East. And the day before that, the chief of, I think it's the U.S., British Columbia Union of First Nations Chiefs, or something to that effect, who is one of the principal people who killed Northern Gateway, said, oops, maybe we should build it. Now, I got to show you something here. See this?
Yeah.
So in 2014, I was at a open house in Regina for the Energy East Pipeline, and they were handing out keychains, and it says Energy East Pipeline. So I just bought a new to me SUV, and so I grabbed a few of them for daily use. And this was my daily reminder that Trudeau had killed Energy East. I wore out these keychains, and I kept it on me every single day. Do you know that pipeline was supposed to be in service in December of 18? And Northern Gateway was supposed to be in service before then. If those two pipes had been built, the threats of Trump saying, we don't need Canadian oil, telling Davos that yesterday, well, okay, we could have shipped 1 million barrels to the East Coast, 500,000 to the West Coast, plus TMX. We wouldn't be in the situation where we are now, where all of a sudden the First Nation guy who hated the pipeline, killed it, whose court cases drug it out, all of a sudden saying, oops.
Well, I hardly even know where to start with
Yeah.
pipelines. The reality is that you want to talk about energy security. Canada doesn't have energy security. Eastern Canada particularly does not. People don't remember this. I mean, where does their energy come from in Eastern Canada? Where is their actual oil coming from that is refined, whether it be in New Brunswick or in Lévis, Quebec? Where does that come from? It comes from the Middle East, or it comes from Venezuela. It does not come from Western Canada. We actually have no capacity beyond loading on rail to ship to Eastern Canada. Their energy, their gasoline that they are putting in their vehicles in Eastern Canada comes from the Middle East, or it comes from Venezuela. It's crazy.
Or Azerbaijan.
Right.
I did a column a few years ago where actually for oil to get from Azerbaijan in the center of Asia, it has to cross pipelines to Turkey, get on a tanker from Turkey, go all the way through the Mediterranean, across the Atlantic, and yet we can't get oil to the East Coast.
Right. And somehow this never appears in our national discourse, to Bronwyn's point. I'm not going to start on the media. You've kind of, Bronwyn's heard a lot of my thoughts on this over the years, but fundamentally unserious, monolithically left-wing in view, highly partisan in inclination. And really just kind of anti-government. That's what anti our government, not anti the Trudeau government. So, if we're hoping for a outbreak of clarity and truthfulness from them, we're not going to have it. So, we need to continue to tell our story in a positive way and talk about why energy infrastructure makes sense, why investments into these spaces and regulatory reforms in this space are going to affect and improve the lives of everyday people across the country. And they will. Having these pipelines constructed will mean a higher standard of living for everybody across the country. It will mean more positive outcomes. It will mean that our comparative wealth will increase. This is really what pays the bills. And at the end of the day, it will mean a better healthcare system in whatever province that you live in. It'll mean better education in whatever province that you live in, because governments are going to have more resources to reinvest into the human capital side of this. This is my fundamental frustration with the left, is that all they ever care about, focus about, talk about, media as well, is the redistribution part. There is never any discussion about how is wealth actually created. How do we actually create the conditions for people to be successful and then hire others and create wealth, which is then reinvested by government into other things that are important to people. This is the industry. Our energy sector, our natural resource sector, is the basis on which the wealth of this nation and frankly of our province have been built. We have so much more that we can do in this space, and that's what we're committed to. We have to be open-eyed about it, and we have to be unapologetic about it, because there are those who are going to fight us every step of the way. And That's something that kind of keeps me going in public life. We'll keep going for a while at least yet. And I'm really looking forward to what we've embarked on here at SaskPower.
Well, I think we've gone half hour over the plan and we could probably go for another 2 hours, but I don't think anyone thinks that we're as good looking as Joe Rogan. So, Minister Harrison, Bronwyn, it's been really great. Is there anything you want to wrap up on, Jeremy, before we call her a day?
I think that probably covers it, Brian. Thanks so much, Brian. Great to see you. And Brian, thanks so much.
All right, just going to do the exit here. Thank you very much, folks. We will be having more people coming up in the future, lining up some people, one of which I'm hoping to get Chris Simoniuk from PayScore talking about how some people don't actually pay their bills in the oil patch, and maybe we should be looking into that. Another one I was just talking to yesterday is Dr. Chris Kiefer, who's one of the key nuclear advocates in Canada. He's all over this stuff in Ontario, and might be able to get him on board. So, Jeremy, you might want to listen to that one because he's apparently not more of a fan of CANDO than he is of GE for some reason. But this podcast, I think, is going to be digging into the deep stuff here. I was on an interview the other day of CTV. They asked me for some stuff. It was a 10-minute interview. They used one sentence. I think that we can provide the depth here that no one else is doing about the energy space, and I really appreciate both your time here today.
Thanks so much.
Thanks, Brian.